Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. We start business today with general questions. Question number 1 from Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with South Lanarkshire Council and the Integrated Joint Board regarding residential care homes.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
The Scottish Government is aware of plans to modernise South Lanarkshire Council residential care facilities in keeping with the Integration Joint Board's strategic commissioning plan to deliver a more flexible care model for older people. We have not had any direct discussions about the configuration of services, as these are matters for local determination. An integration meeting between Scottish Government officials and representatives from the Integration Authority, the NHS Board and the Council will take place on the 23rd of May.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her response. South Lanarkshire Council's care homes have an excellent reputation and they're valued by residents and their families. The Cabinet Secretary talked about modernisation, but the Council is looking to close care homes and 100 long-term beds could be lost across South Lanarkshire if the proposals are implemented in full. Does the Minister or does the Cabinet Secretary agree that local communities are right to be concerned given the projected 25% increase in the over 75 population in our area in the 10 years leading up to 2026? And whilst I appreciate it's a local decision, can the Cabinet Secretary advise what national guidance is available to councils who are looking to close care homes?
Cabinet Secretary.
So my understanding is that the current model of delivery has remained static for over 20 years, and I think anyone would understand, therefore, that the current model no longer is fit for purpose in terms of significant changes, not only in demographic demand, but in where people want to receive care and in the complexity of their needs. In addition, 4 of the 8 care homes are ageing. So what I understand South Lanarkshire is doing is developing an innovative, flexible care model. They undertook in 2016 a pilot test of change with existing care facilities through the provision of 22 intermediate transitional beds and increased focus on enabling so that people could return home. Of those people supported, 56% successfully returned home, supporting that proposition. So what I will be interested in seeing is how they want to remodel and reconfigure the balance of care in order to respond to what we know are people's preferences, which is to receive care at home if that is possible or in a homely setting, and to see the effective use of intermediate care beds and enabling services. And that is why the purpose of the meeting that will be held later in May with my officials will be to look and see two things. What is the shape of that remodelling? What has been the level of consultation, which I understand to date has been significant, and what is the phased proposition from that IJB, so that we can be sure that they are addressing what they can evidence by way of local need and local demand.
Graham Simpson.
Thank you. I'm encouraged to hear that that meeting will be taking place, but this whole move to get people out of care homes and back into the community, staying in their own homes, started in South Lanarkshire under a Labour council when both Monica Lennon and myself were councillors there. Does the Cabinet Secretary not agree that this smacks of hypocrisy from the Labour Party?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's not for me to comment. Members will draw their own conclusions from that. But of course, Mr Simpson is absolutely right that in some aspects, in terms of our developing thinking on integration and the need and desire for people to receive the care that they require in their own home or in a homely setting, was founded in some measure on the impact and the innovation that South Lanarkshire Council introduced. And we are, of course, grateful to them for that. And, of course, the whole point about health and social care partnerships and integrated joint boards is that they can take account of the needs of their local population and commission and plan the redesign of services in order to meet that need. And in that instance, I wouldn't want diktats from any central government to intervene with those important local decisions, albeit that we need to make sure that they are properly consulted on and that the care on offer is one that is safe, effective and person-centred.
Question number 2, James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve performance on ScotRail services.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, the remedial plan in place with ScotRail will aim to address performance issues. Over the last reporting period, around 9 out of 10 trains ran on time, the best punctuality in Scotland's railways since September last year. Within the Glasgow area, ScotRail Alliance's implementation of the Donovan recommendations has improved performance across the Strathclyde Electric's network, with the last period delivering over 1% ppm improvement compared to the previous period. Network Rail's £5 million investment in delivering consistently high ppm of above 94% at Glasgow Central in the last 3 periods, with some weeks as high as 97%.
James Kelly.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The latest figures for Glasgow Central Low Level, a station widely used by passengers travelling from Rutherglen and Cambuslang, show that 51.9% of trains, more than half, did not arrive in time. These figures are atrocious and are made worse by yesterday's revelations of the Which survey, showing that the ScotRail compensation scheme was one of the most complicated in the UK, with some passengers needing to retrieve 24 pieces of information to make a claim. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what he is doing to reverse these drastic performance figures, and will he review immediately the compensation claim at ScotRail to make it easier for passengers to claim compensation?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, Presiding Officer, on the member's latter point, we would expect ScotRail to look at how they can simplify the existing process to help those who are claiming compensation to be able to do so as reasonably as possible. On the principal point which the member has raised, as I've already pointed out, the performance within the Strathclyde Electric area, which includes the lower line that the member refers to at Argyll Street, has saw improvements overall. However, there's still more to be done. That's one of the key things that were set out within the Donovan Review in order to drive up improvement, and the £5 million of investment in the Glasgow Electrics area is about helping to make sure that's done. The member might also want to consider the report which was issued by the ORR last year, towards the end of last year, reviewing the work that's been undertaken around the Donovan recommendations and highlighted that good progress has been made, but there is still more to be done. And what we need to do is to make sure that both ScotRail and Network Rail are implementing these changes in order to make sure we get the type of service improvements that we want to see being sustained on an ongoing basis.
And Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary might be aware that ScotRail are trying to encourage retired drivers out of retirement and into service. Is that a sign that there is a shortage of drivers on ScotRail? And given that it takes 18 months to train a new driver, is he concerned, as I am, that there may be shortfalls and that will affect services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it should come as no surprise to the member that he would recognise that within the remedial plan, ScotRail have indicated they intend to employ an extra 55 drivers in order to make sure that they've got greater resilience within their train crew numbers overall, something which we support and are encouraging them to make sure they make good progress on. How they go about recruiting those drivers is a matter for them as an operational issue, but I'm sure the member would welcome the provisions which were set out within a remedial plan to address the very issue around crewing numbers, and that involves recruiting an extra 55 drivers.
Thanks. Just to make it clear, I'm not going to take the two additional members who wish to ask questions because we're not making much progress through the questions. Question 3 has been withdrawn. Question 4, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the noise surveys of the upgraded section of the M74.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Myers.
The ambient noise assessment has commenced and is expected to be completed by the end of this month. The results will be published on the Transport Scotland website as soon as they are available. In addition to this, a further ambient noise assessment will be carried out within 3 months of all snagging works being completed. This will establish if the ambient noise levels exceed the pre-construction ambient noise levels or the levels reported in the environmental statement.
Richard Lyle.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. When the work was carried out in M74 by contractors, they removed quite a number of full-grown trees and bushes which acted as a noise reducer. In place of the full-grown trees and substantial bushes, through my pressure and discussions with Transport Scotland, they have now been replaced by what I can only call very few twig trees and very small bushes along the route. Local primary school and my constituents who back onto M74 are not happy, as I am not. What more could be done, Cabinet Secretary, to alleviate the noise in this section of the motorway?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, my understanding is that the type of trees and bushes which they tend to plant along major trunk routes are ones which are fast growing in order to help to address the type of issue which the member has raised, and that's my understanding of what's happened in this particular instance, although that will take a number of years for those to be fully established. What I can say to the member is that if the ambient noise assessment which has been undertaken at the present time highlights that there are ongoing issues in relation to noise which are out with what was predicted prior to the construction of the M74 upgrade section, then further measures may have to then be taken. But once this study has been completed, we'll then have a better understanding of those levels and whether further measures need to be implemented.
Thank you. Question number 5, Colin Beattie.
To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to celebrate International Museum Day on the 18th of May.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
International Museums Day is a great opportunity for museums to engage with the public in creative activities. The popularity of this annual event has grown, and in 2018 more than 40,000 museums participated in 158 countries. Scotland will be playing its part this year when the theme is Museums as Cultural Hubs, and I look forward to speaking at the Garden Lobby reception to mark International Museums Day on the 14th of May. And I would encourage colleagues to attend the reception and help celebrate the event by visiting a local museum on the 18th of May.
Colin Beattie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. The Cabinet Secretary may be aware of the parliamentary event I'm sponsoring on the 14th of May in conjunction with Museums Galleries Scotland. Can she outline what support the Scottish Government intends to provide to museums across Scotland this year to ensure these vital elements of local, national and global history and culture remain embedded in our communities?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government is a strong supporter of the museum sector. The 1920 budget allocates a total of over £50 million funding to support Scotland's museums and galleries, including grant and aid funding to the National Museums and National Galleries, as well as support for Scotland's 3 national industrial museums and the V&A in Dundee. We don't provide core funding to local museums as they are funded by their local authorities. However, we do support Museum Galleries Scotland, the national development body, which provides advice on all matters relating to museums and galleries, and the 2019-20 budget includes £2.5 million for Museum Galleries Scotland to support the sector.
Thank you very much. Question number 6, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government its position on the use of big data to tackle societal inequality.
Cabinet Secretary Eileen Campbell.
The Scottish Government is committed to using data to improve outcomes for the people of Scotland and to help us work towards meeting our objectives set out in the National Performance Framework. We use big data to inform policy and practice and tackle complex problems such as societal inequality, health and homelessness, as well as unemployment, and to support work in many other portfolio areas.
Claire Adamson.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer. According to the United Nations Women Report, Gender Equality and Big Data, Making Gender Data Visible, big data has an essential role to play in achieving sustainable development goals, particularly the empowerment of women. What use can the Scottish Government make of big data analytics to improve the lives of women and girls in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government has, as I said in my previous answer, a vision that data is used systematically to improve decision-making outcomes in the lives of our citizens, and we absolutely recognise the opportunities this creates to improve the lives for women and for girls. For example, since October last year, the Government is involved in the Administrative Data for Research Scotland, part of the Administrative Data Research Partnership, and that aims to champion the use of data for research in the public interest by bringing together world-leading academic research to the important social and economic challenges that we face. And this partnership builds on the first phase, which delivered insight into maternal and children's health outcomes. And we're also providing £1.5 million over 3 years to support the establishment of a UNICEF Data for Children hub in Scotland. But we'll continue to explore other ways we can use and improve outcomes using big data, and happy to further do that with Claire Adamson, who I know has particular expertise and knowledge in this field.
Question number 7, Angela Constance.
To ask the Scottish Government how it is supporting suicide prevention work in the Almond Valley constituency.
Minister Claire Hawkey.
In August 2018, the Scottish Government published its Suicide Prevention Action Plan, Every Life Matters. This sets out 10 measures to continue the strong decline in the country's rates of deaths by suicide. It has a target to reduce the rate by 20% by 2022 from a 2017 baseline. The approach to suicide prevention work in West Lothian is currently under review, and once this review is complete, a new strategy and action plan will be developed. Action 1 of the Suicide Prevention Action Plan commits the National Suicide Leadership Group to make recommendations on supporting the development and delivery of local prevention action plans, and is backed by £3 million of funding over the course of this current Parliament.
Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, Neil's Hugs is a charity in my constituency that supports families and friends affected by suicide. And they say that our top priorities must be to ensure that no one who has attempted suicide should leave hospital without immediate follow-up support. And also, we must reduce waiting times for child and adolescent mental health services. So given that NHS Lothian are a poorer performing health board in this regard, how will the Minister ensure that we do more earlier to prevent poor mental health and suicide?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm aware of the charity that Angela Constance speaks of, and Donna Patterson-Harvey, the Chief Executive of Neil's Hubs Foundation, has been involved in the lived experience events hosted by the Health and Social Care Alliance for the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group, and I thank her for her participation in that, as well as others with lived experience. The member will also be aware that last year the Scottish Government and COSLA announced a joint task force on children and young people's mental health, and the task force is examining our whole approach to mental health services. Specialist clinical services are not the whole answer, and other services in young people's lives are vital to provide practical and emotional support, including education, social work and the third sector.
Question number 8, Kezia Dugdale.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that some tattoo parlours are refusing services to customers who disclose their HIV status.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
Like the member, I'm concerned to hear of the difficulties that some HIV-positive people are experiencing in getting a tattoo. I'm clear that there is absolutely no place for HIV stigma in today's Scotland. The standard infection control procedures that all tattoo studios should have in place provide protection against transmission of bloodborne viruses, including HIV.
Kezia Dugdale.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer. Can he confirm that it's actually a breach of the Equality Act to refuse service to somebody because of their HIV status, and ask him to encourage local authorities where these tattoo parlours exist to revoke the licences of those who are discriminating against HIV people?
Minister.
I think the member makes a very important point. I understand that HIV Scotland is working with British HIV Association to develop a consensus statement on this matter, and once that statement is available, we'll ask local authorities to highlight this to all tattoo studios. This should not be happening in Scotland, and I think we need to raise awareness, and it's part of that tackling stigma that I think we all want to achieve.
Thank you. Question number 9, Rachel Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it can take in response to Christian persecution overseas.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
The Scottish Government condemns all incidents of religious persecution and the targeting of innocent people based on their beliefs. The appalling attacks in Sri Lanka and Christchurch highlight the need for continued international effort to end religious persecution. The First Minister wrote offering condolences and solidarity to the people of Sri Lanka and New Zealand, and the Scottish Government has repeatedly raised concerns over religious persecution overseas with the UK Government. The Scottish Government is committed to ensuring that Scotland is a modern, inclusive nation which protects, respects and realises internationally recognised human rights.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and we, the Scottish Conservatives, align ourselves with the comments about the atrocities in Sri Lanka. 80% of people who suffer persecution because of their faith are Christian, which is nearly 250 million people across the world. Scotland has a proud Christian heritage, and the UK Government recently launched a review into the response into persecution of Christians abroad. I hope the Cabinet Secretary will join me in welcoming this. Can I ask what support the Scottish Government can provide to ensure Christians are protected here in Scotland, and what action it is taking to prevent hatred towards religious groups through better education?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely welcome any efforts to ensure that we continue to provide support to people around the world, but also to build on our vision, which is a modern, inclusive world which respects and realises internationally recognised human rights and protects people who want to practice their faith. I also would happily meet with Rachel Hamilton to discuss this further, given time constraints. But absolutely, we provide support through Interfaith Scotland, the dialogue that we have to promote and support international interfaith work to ensure that we can create that tolerant society, that modern, inclusive Scotland that I think we all support and want to see achieved. And we continue to do that through working with Interfaith Scotland, other faith groups, and certainly after following the Sri Lanka attacks, I wrote to many members of the Christian faith in Scotland to make sure that we stood in solidarity with them, to support them, and to make sure that they understood that we stood in solidarity with them here in Scotland, but also more widely across the world as well.
Thank you very much, and that concludes general questions. And before we turn to First Minister's questions, could I invite members to join me in welcoming to our gallery the Honourable Sue Hickey, Speaker of the Tasmanian House of Assembly. Thank you. We move now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Does the First Minister accept that what she describes as a positive destination for young people when they leave school may in fact be no such thing?
First Minister.
No, we want to see all of our young people go into not just positive destinations but meaningful destinations. That means further education, further training or a good and meaningful job. I heard Ruth Davidson talk at the weekend about the concept of lifelong apprenticeships. I'm not sure if she's aware that we already have lifelong apprenticeships in Scotland. There's no age limit on our modern apprenticeships, and of course we are increasing the number just as we are increasing the reach of vocational education in our classrooms. So we'll get on with doing the job of improving education, early years, school education, further and higher education, and the routes into work for all of our young people.
Ruth Davidson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, but my question quoted directly from IPPR Scotland, a well-respected think tank, which this week welcomed Scottish Conservative proposals to introduce a new skills participation age of 18. It warned that what the SNP government calls positive destinations for young people are often no such thing, and that in reality we're letting young people down right across Scotland. Whereas Keir Bloomer, the architect of Curriculum for Excellence, said the Leaver destination statistics are a fraud. Under this SNP government, the proportion of pupils leaving school with no qualifications whatsoever is at the highest level since 2011, and many others are leaving school at 16 without going on to get the skills and education that they need to thrive in the modern world. Now, I know that this is the First Minister's stated priority, so can she tell me what percentage of 16 to 19-year-olds are currently not in education or in any formal training?
First Minister.
Well, there are 95% of those who leave school are, after 3 months from leaving school, are in work, training or study. And I'm sorry to disagree with Ruth Davidson, but I don't consider a young person in further education or in higher education or doing a modern apprenticeship as not being doing something positive and meaningful. It's also the case that since 2014, we've reduced youth unemployment in this country by 40%. We're seeing rising numbers staying on in school. There are more people staying on beyond 16 in school now than has ever been the case before. And of course, we're seeing record numbers going into positive destinations. And in terms of school qualifications, I had this exchange a couple of weeks ago with Jackson Carlaw. We actually see now a higher proportion of young people getting qualifications at level 5, 71% in 2007, 86% now. A higher percentage getting qualifications at level 6, 41% in 2007, 62% now, and more young people, of course, leaving school with 5 or more hires. So the problem with the analysis that Ruth Davidson brings to this chamber is that it's not borne out by the excellent results being achieved by young people the length and breadth of our country.
Ruth Davidson.
I might have been away for 6 months, but the format hasn't changed, because the First Minister is once again answering a different question to the question that she was asked. And the figure is 1 in 5. Fully 20% of our 16 to 19-year-olds are without any form of education or formal training, a figure which has been flatlining for years. And I say that is simply wrong. Now, we're not the only people that are talking about a skills participation age of 18. Indeed, it already works well in Belgium, in Denmark and in the Netherlands. And it had previously been proposed here in Scotland too. But when this SNP government came to power, the idea was quietly dropped, with no explanation ever really given as to why. Does the First Minister believe that that was a mistake?
First Minister.
No, I think the policies we are pursuing to make sure more of our young people leave school with qualifications, more of our young people go into work, training or further study, I think these are the right policies to pursue, and we will continue to do so. Just as an aside though, I suspect that a lot of the people that Ruth Davidson, young people that Ruth Davidson has just cited there as not being in study or training are actually young people that are in work. And I go back to the statistics I quoted earlier on. We have reduced youth unemployment in this country by 40% in the last 5 years. We also see modern apprenticeships increasing. There are now foundation apprenticeships available at the vast majority of secondary schools across our country. That is also increasing. So more of our young people are leaving school with qualifications. More of our young people are leaving school with vocational qualifications, and more of our young people than ever before are going into good, positive, meaningful destinations. And also the attainment gap there is narrowing as well. So we will continue to pursue and implement the policies that are delivering these results for young people all over our country.
Ruth Davidson.
Half the time she complains folk don't bring ideas to the chamber. Today she's complaining that we do. Because, Presiding Officer, this is a pretty serious proposal, and there is no reason why it can't command cross-party support. Now, I believe that we could all agree that we're not doing nearly enough for young people who don't go to university, and that politicians of all stripes need to up our game in our delivery for them. For all the time debating the powers of this place, and we've seen the government put another one on hold this week, education and training is an area where this chamber is able to act. It's able to act immediately, it's able to act without question. So I ask the First Minister, does she accept the need for change now? And when it comes to a skills participation age of 18, will she today give a commitment to act now?
First Minister.
Commitment that we will continue to act as we are doing. We will continue to take forward the policies in our schools, the policies on modern apprenticeships, the policies on foundation apprenticeships, the places at further education, the investments in free higher education, which will always remain with the SNP. And as I said earlier to Ruth Davidson and said to her deputy a couple of weeks ago, the problem with her analysis, of course, is that it is not borne out by the results that our young people are getting in our education system and as they go on into work. We will consider ideas from wherever they come. I would simply say to Ruth Davidson, if this idea is such a great one, why didn't she bother mentioning it in this leaflet she sent out to every voter across the country, where she manages to mention independence 15 times, she manages to mention me 12 times, thank you very much for the free publicity, but not a single idea, not a single policy, because actually the Tories don't have any.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, this week marks 20 years of this Scottish Parliament. 20 years when this Parliament has had full control over housing policy. And during that time, the private rented sector in Scotland has trebled in size. We have seen the return of private landlordism, and rents have soared whilst wages have stagnated. The government's response is rent pressure zones, but Edinburgh City Council concluded that rent pressure zones are not fit for purpose. Does the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
Well, the private rented sector has increased. I know that from the experience of my own constituency. Many members will know the same. But that's why we have introduced legislation to reform the private rented sector. For example, the policy that has just been announced for consultation south of the border, getting rid of no-fault evictions, is something that this government has already done and implemented. Rent pressure zones was the way forward. We will continue to look at whether that is appropriate and satisfactory, and where further action is required, we will consider taking that further action. But what we are also doing, which I have to point out, the last Labour administration in the early days of this Scottish Parliament didn't do, is invest in affordable social housing for rent as well. We are putting record sums into that. And we are delivering record numbers of affordable and social housing. We've also made reforms at getting rid of the right to buy as well. So this government's record on housing is a good one, and we will continue to make sure that we deliver the policies that people across the country need.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, I think the First Minister's calculator needs adjusting, because Labour built 35,000 social houses when we were in power. Over the past 15 years, a private rented home has become the only housing option for an increasing number of families right across Scotland. And housing costs are eating into people's incomes. And year on year, rents are going up. The average rent for a two-bedroom home in Greater Glasgow has increased by over 30% in the last decade. In Lothian, the increase is by over 40%. And these increases are driving more and more families into poverty. Can the First Minister tell us how many children in Scotland in the private rented sector are now living in poverty?
First Minister.
Children in Scotland, whether they're in the private rented sector or the social rented sector or in any sector, are living in poverty, and largely the increases in poverty are down to the welfare cuts being imposed by a Tory government that Richard Leonard still wants them to have the ability to do. In terms of the private rented sector, we have taken action already. The private housing Tenancies Scotland Act 2016, which was the most significant change in private renting in Scotland for 30 years, gives tenants greater security, greater stability and greater predictability. The new private residential tenancy, landlords can't evict a tenant simply because the tenancy reaches an end. And of course that Act also provides a range of measures to help tackle high rents, limiting rent increases to once in 12 months, enabling tenants to challenge unfair rent increases, and also providing local authorities with the power to designate an area as a rent pressure zone. And perhaps it's because of all of that that the latest data from the Office of National Statistics shows that increases in rent in Scotland across all private tenancies are lower than in England or in Labour-run Wales. So we are taking the action that needs to be taken, and we will continue to do so. But unlike Richard Leonard, we will also continue to oppose not just the Tory welfare policies that are driving people into poverty, but we will continue to oppose having those powers in the hands of the Tories in the first place.
Richard Leonard.
Well, if you use the powers that you've got, you might have a better case to make for having more of them. Presiding Officer, the First Minister talks about the latest data. The latest data, according to the Scottish Government's own figures, is that over 40% of all children living in the private rented sector in Scotland are now living in poverty. That's 60,000 children. And here in Edinburgh, there is a particularly acute problem, which is why Dr. Jim McCormack of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently concluded, and I quote, "Here and now, the single biggest challenge for Edinburgh is housing costs. The pathway to poverty reduction in Edinburgh has a lot to do with getting control of rents in the private rented sector." Next week, Labour will take the next step in the parliamentary process with our Mary Barber law. We think that private sector rent rises should be capped and controlled. So the First Minister has a choice. Will she take the side of rogue landlords and a broken housing market, or will she join with us, side with tenants, tackle poverty and back our Mary Barber bill?
First Minister.
Well, we'll continue to do what we have done over these past few years, and that is lead from the front in the changes that people in the private rented sector need, and we will continue to do that. Poverty rates, child poverty rates are too high in Scotland, not just in the private rented sector but across our society. In Scotland, the child poverty rate is 22%. That is far too high, but I should say it is lower than the 26% in Wales, where Labour right now are in government, which shows that Labour talk about all the things they would do in government, but when they're in government they somehow forget to do any of them. So we will continue to take the action that keeps rent increases lower than in other parts of the UK, that gets child poverty down, and we'll consider all proposals that come forward on their merit. But we won't wait for Labour, because if we waited for Labour over these past number of years, we wouldn't have the changes we already have, and we wouldn't have the record numbers of affordable and social housing that are now being delivered across Scotland, which stands in sharp contrast to the 6 council houses built under the last Labour government.
There's a number of constituency supplementaries. The first from John Scott, to be followed by Christine Graham. John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of allegations of staff bullying at NHS Ayrshire and Arran hospitals, and I share these concerns raised by staff in the press. My concern is for patient safety and also the safety of staff in a mental health context, not just in the radiology department, but across all staff in the hospitals, where regrettably my constituents have in the past made similar allegations of bullying as well. Today, the Studdart report will be published into allegations of bullying in NHS Highland. Will the First Minister now consider a similar investigation into these concerns raised by staff in Ayrshire?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say that we take all allegations of bullying in the NHS extremely seriously, as you would expect us to do. Indeed, the Health Secretary will this afternoon make a statement to Parliament on the Sturrock review, which I think is a sign of how seriously we do take these issues when they are raised with us. In terms of the NHS Ayrshire and Arran situation, the Health Board has advised that they are in contact with the Society of Radiographers, and the Chief Executive offered to meet with the staff concerned. I understand that that offer was declined, so arrangements are now in place to hear the grievance in accordance with the board policy. I think it is important now that that internal grievance process is given the chance to conclude in line with employment law before there is any consideration of further action. But I will give an assurance that these issues are always taken extremely seriously by the Government.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, changes to parking policy at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh has meant several of my constituents working there now have their staff parking permits under review, and if these are revoked because of shift work and travelling from rural areas, the option of public transport simply doesn't exist. Some may even have to give up their jobs there, apart from the current stress they're undergoing. Notwithstanding this is a private finance hospital and the contract for parking is private, is there a role for the Scottish Government, as these changes must surely affect the delivery of healthcare in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of the change to policy that Christine Graham raises, I would thank her for raising this. I'll ask the Health Secretary to look into that and see whether there is any action that requires to be taken. We want staff working in our NHS to be able to park if they are required to do so at our hospitals. In terms of the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, of course, if that wasn't a PFI contract entered into under a previous administration, we'd be able to abolish car parking charges there, as we've done so already at NHS car parks across the country. But I will undertake to ask Jean Freeman to look into the specific issue Christine Graham raises and get back to her as soon as possible.
Tavish Scott, to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The central nursery in Shetland will close in a month's time. The nursery have failed to recruit staff because the public sector are paying more and recruiting to fulfil the expansion of childcare. 20 families will be directly affected by the loss of the nursery run by Mary Jimison and her team. What can the First Minister do to ensure that wraparound care is provided, particularly for mums who want to stay in work at a time when this expansion is happening, so that these private sector nurseries can stay open rather than being forced to close?
First Minister.
I'm happy to ask Marie Todd, the Childcare Minister, to liaise with the member and indeed with Shetland Council about the particular issue raised about the nursery. Generally speaking, of course, the expansion of early years and childcare is extremely important, and in terms of recruitment and funding, part of the funding deal we have reached with local authorities includes money to allow fair funding rates for private sector local authorities so that fair wages can be paid there as well. And of course we insist on the living wage being paid. It's important that as well as the expansion, we do work with local authorities, and local authorities work with private and third sector providers to ensure that wraparound care that is important for parents. But I will ask Marie Todd to look into the specific issues and to see, and then after that to come back to Tavish Scott in more detail.
And Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, on Monday night next week, Dundee City Council will consider a very worrying report on attainment in our schools. At S3, Dundee's results are down across every literacy and numeracy indicator, and the attainment gap is closing, not because results are markedly better in our poorest communities, but because attainment has declined rapidly among our most affluent pupils. Does the First Minister think that the problem could be the £3 million that SNP have taken out of Dundee education budget this year alone, the 160 teachers they have taken out of our secondary schools since they came to power in the city, their blanket policy across the city of limiting Dundee pupils to 6 qualifications in S4, teaching S4, 5 and 6 in the same classroom in some schools, and the disappearance of some core subjects in some schools? Or what does the First Minister think the problem is, or the reasons are, and what is she going to do about it?
First Minister.
Well, it is right that Dundee City Council looks closely at its attainment figures, and if there is action it requires to take, that it takes that action. In terms of the Scottish Government, we are providing additional funding to local authorities generally, but also additional funding specifically for attainment through the Pupil Equity Fund, which schools and teachers the length and breadth of the country are using to good effect to close the attainment gap. And we will continue to work with and support councils to make sure that the right action is taken, not just to raise attainment, but to close the attainment gap as well. And that applies to Dundee City Council as it does to every council across the country.
Thank you. And question number 3 from Willie Rennie.
This week, the Scottish Government abandoned its plan to abolish air passenger duty. It said it was not consistent with its climate change ambitions. Is the First Minister seriously telling us she's only recently discovered that hundreds of extra flights are bad for climate change? So will the Government now ditch its support for the third runway at Heathrow?
First Minister.
Well, I'm sure Willie Rennie didn't forget to notice last week that we had a new report from the Committee on Climate Change that recommended increased targets on tackling emissions and reducing emissions. We, unlike any other government so far in the UK, have accepted those recommendations. So that means we have to look across the range of our policies to make sure that they do align with that increased scale of ambition. The air departure tax is one of those policies. There's a case that can be made for that. I have made that case often in the past, but it doesn't any longer align with the ambition we have to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. And as I said in this chamber last week, and as I said very, very openly, we will require to look at all of our policies across all areas of Scottish Government responsibility through that new lens of climate change. So whether it's the policy that Willie Rennie cites today or any other policy, that's the commitment that we are making. But I put back the same challenge that I did last week to all of the opposition parties, with the exception of the Greens, in this chamber. When we come to discuss workplace parking over the next few weeks, are the opposition parties going to look at that through the lens of climate change, or are they going to stick to their knee-jerk anti-climate opposition?
Willie Rennie.
I think everyone will have noticed that the First Minister deliberately dodged my question. The question was about Heathrow and the third runway. The time for dithering, First Minister, is over. A third runway with hundreds of extra flights will not help climate change. I can't understand why the Scottish Government chose the 20th anniversary of the Scottish Parliament to hand a raft of powers back to Westminster. When John Swinney handed back income tax powers, we thought it was a one-off. But this week, it was powers away on value-added tax. And of course, social security powers have been sent back for 5 years. We've had the shambles of the police merger, the law on waiting times broken, schools slipping down the international rankings, and the failing railways. After 12 years in power, isn't it true that she is handing back powers to Westminster because her government is so incompetent it just cannot cope?
First Minister.
You know, if all of that is true, imagine how frustrating it must be for Willie Rennie to know that we're still, around 30 points ahead of his party in the opinion polls. For goodness sake, the fact of the matter is, whether it's polls, whether it's real elections, people in Scotland know the achievements of this SNP Scottish Government, which is why they want us to continue in office. And on powers for this Parliament, take welfare. It's because of our use of new powers that every carer across Scotland right now is getting an extra £450 a year. It's because of our use of new powers that low-income families are getting more help when they have a child, or when that child goes to nursery, or again when that child starts school. And on the issue of VAT, I mean, really? What power exactly is being devolved to this Parliament over VAT? No power to set the rates or levels of VAT, just an assignment of revenues based on dodgy estimates. And I have to ask Willie Rennie, when you've got the Fraser of Allender Institute saying that this exposes the Scottish budget to unnecessary and unreasonable risk and is not a good way forward, why on earth does the Scottish Liberal Democrats want to do that to the Scottish budget? If they keep taking positions like that, they'll keep languishing in the opinion polls.
We're going to take a few supplementaries. The first from Neil Findlay, to be followed by Jamie Green. Neil Findlay.
This week I have been contacted by constituents who are victims of mesh but do not want to be named. They have raised with me the issue of women being directed to so-called centres of excellence in Edinburgh and Glasgow for treatment, where many have received partial mesh removal, producing very poor and debilitating results. The belief is that clinicians at these centres do not have the required skill set to carry out full mesh removal using the latest techniques. One woman who is not my constituent, who has broken her anonymity, is Claire Daisley, who will lose her bowel and bladder if she doesn't get a full mesh removal within the next 2 months. Will the First Minister personally intervene in Claire's case to ensure that she gets the treatment she deserves? And will she halt partial mesh removal at these centres until a full appraisal is carried out?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I thank Neil Findlay for raising what we all agree is an important issue. I will obviously not clinically intervene in any individual's case, but I will undertake to have the Health Secretary look into the case that has been brought to Parliament today, and to make sure that all possible is being done for that individual concerned. More generally, as Neil Findlay knows, the Health Secretary met with a group of women. I think that was facilitated or certainly attended by Neil Findlay. As a result of that, a group of medical directors and senior clinical managers are looking at a range of options to improve care and support. The group's considering the course of care for women who suffer complications and examining a whole range of issues. It met for the first time in early April, and I can tell the Chamber today it will meet for a second time tomorrow, and that group will make recommendations to Health Board Chief Executives and aims to do so by the autumn of this year. And that group will fully take into account the views that patients are expressing. The last thing I would say to Neil Findlay, I absolutely understand why some women will want to retain anonymity and privacy, but if there are any individual women that Neil Findlay is aware of who want confidentially to speak to the Health Secretary or to health officials, then we would be very happy and very keen indeed to facilitate that on the assurance of protecting the privacy and anonymity of them.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Bruce Crawford. Jamie Green.
Thank you. Visitors from China spend £36 million per year in Scotland. And last year, First Minister, you said tourism is a vital part of Scotland's economy, and these figures demonstrate the growing significance of Chinese visitors. But yesterday we learned that Scotland's only direct route to the country has stopped taking bookings from this September, and the future of the route is now in doubt. Does the First Minister share my concern that the potential loss of this route will be a huge loss to the Scottish economy, to Scottish tourism, and that the government should do everything in its power to retain such routes?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government works very hard with our airports to protect air routes. In terms of the Hainan service, we are disappointed that it has suspended its winter schedule. We hope the service will return for the summer season when passenger numbers are likely to be higher, and we will work with the airport and the airline to secure that. Hainan obviously operate other services, and we hope that they will continue to do the Dublin and Edinburgh service as well. In terms of tourism, our tourism sector has been a real area of success in recent years. We know they face a number of challenges, and we work very closely and will continue to work very closely with our tourism sector to support the continued sustainable growth of what is a Scottish economic success story.
Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, Michael Gove told the Tory conference that he wanted the UK Government to get involved in devolved areas like health and education in Scotland. He said he wanted to change the rules to do that. Does the First Minister agree with me that after 20 years of devolution, the Tory Government at Westminster should keep their grubby hands off this people of Scotland's Parliament?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. When they do devolve powers, they shouldn't send us faulty goods, as they have tried to do on VAT and ADT, and they should stop the creeping centralisation that we are seeing as a result of their Brexit chaos. This Parliament is better placed than a Tory government or any UK government to decide what's right for the people of Scotland, and the sooner we see more powers in this Parliament, in fact the sooner we see this Parliament as an independent Parliament, the better for everyone.
Maurice Corrie.
Presiding Officer, for 50 years, generations of submariners based at Her Majesty's Naval Base Clyde and Fez Lane in my region, supported by their families, have borne the huge responsibility of protecting the UK. They have accepted the sacrifice and commitment inherent in this duty. Their professionalism has never wavered, and they have delivered on their key task, often for many months at a time. Would the First Minister join me in recognising the professionalism, The innovation, dedication and skills of thousands of people at Faslane and Coulport who have supported and crewed our submarines for more than 350 patrols without 1 minute's break for 50 years, and thank them, their families and veterans most sincerely for their dedication and support to the Royal Navy's submarine service and to our country's security.
First Minister.
Yes, I would. I take a very different view to the member on the future of nuclear weapons and the nuclear deterrent. I want to see Scotland and indeed the world be free of nuclear weapons, but that is no reflection whatsoever on the professionalism and the dedication of our service personnel. I would want to see Faslane in a nuclear-free Scotland continue as a naval base. So I take this opportunity today to pay tribute to the dedication, the commitment and the professionalism, not just of submariners working in our services, but all service personnel who work so hard to keep all of us safe.
Thank you. Question number 4, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government considers the drug policy should be devolved or amended.
First Minister.
Yes, we believe there is a compelling case that the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 needs to be substantially amended so that action can be taken to help halt the emergency of drugs deaths. If the UK Government continues to refuse to allow Scotland to take innovative approaches to tackling drug deaths, such as establishing medically supervised drug consumption facilities, we call on them to devolve the powers to this Parliament so that we can do what is necessary. This week, the Scottish Affairs Committee began their inquiry into problem drug use to examine the issue. The evidence submitted to the committee so far overwhelmingly supports the need for Scotland to be given additional powers in this area.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank the First Minister for that reply, and also like to refer members to my register of interests. Despite the emergency, the UK Government still refuses to act, and in November every party in this Parliament, except the Tories, voted to call on the UK Government to change the law to allow safe consumption facilities or empower the Scottish Parliament to do so. Does the First Minister agree that further UK Government delay means further harm, further deaths for some of the most vulnerable people in Scotland?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. I think there is a recognition across this Parliament, and I think that is without exception, that we need to look at different ways of tackling the drugs challenge, and in particular reducing the number of people who lose their lives to drugs. But as Jackson Callow and I spoke about a few weeks ago, that does mean a willingness to look at different approaches and to be innovative. The Tories have called on the Government to do that. We are willing to do that. But I would today again call on the Tories to drop the knee-jerk opposition to safe consumption facilities. Dr Andrew Macaulay, who's a senior research fellow at Glasgow Caledonian University, has said just recently that Glasgow's case for a drug consumption room is arguably the most compelling Europe has seen. So if it is the case that the UK Government will not act to do that, then it should devolve the powers to allow this Parliament to do that as part of an overall approach to making sure we take the innovative action to deal with what is a massive challenge for all of us.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I agree with the First Minister. There is a cross-party consensus that we need to see change on this. There's two things the First Minister could do. Firstly, an independent review of the methadone programme in Scotland, and secondly, a third sector-led review of recovery services. Will she commit to that today?
First Minister.
We are already convening an expert group to examine exactly what changes, either in practice or in the law, could help save lives and reduce harm. So we are doing the kind of things that Miles Briggs is calling for us to do. And our mind is not closed to any suggestion that comes forward about how we can do this differently. My ask of others, though, is not to close their minds. When we have health professionals and experts in this field saying that this is one of the most important things we could do in Glasgow right now, then it is unconscionable that we have a UK Government, despite admitting that they know the benefits it might bring, standing in the way of that. So if we're going to have an open-minded approach to this, which I'm certainly signed up to, that has to apply right across the board. And sadly, the Tories so far have been found completely lacking and wanting in this.
Question number 5, Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in light of recent analysis which suggests that a record number of Scottish shops closed in the first few months of the year.
First Minister.
Well, we're doing everything within our power to support all sectors of our economy, including retail. We have enhanced measures to support both new development and reuse of vacant property in town centres as part of a total rates relief package of around £750 million. That includes the small business bonus scheme, which of course lifts over 100,000 properties out of business rates altogether. In addition to that, we've established a £50 million capital town centre fund to enable local authorities to stimulate and support a wide range of investments which encourage town centres to diversify. And in 2017-18, there were over 1,600 new starts in the retail modern apprenticeship framework.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the First Minister for that response. Is it not the case that the single most detrimental effect on our high streets are the crippling business rates, and in particular the large business supplement, which this government is imposing on hard-working retailers? Some business owners in my own region have had to endure eye-watering increases, which are making both the cost and stress of operating premises unsustainable. So what further action will the First Minister take to turn this tide?
First Minister.
Well, we'll continue to support retail and we'll continue to support our town centres, but that question is absolutely staggering in just how much it ignores about what is being done already in Scotland. We have the most competitive business rates package anywhere in the UK. That involves the lowest business rates poundage in the UK, which ensures that over 90% of properties are charged a lower rate than they would be in England. We've got the most generous package of reliefs, which, as I said a moment ago, is worth over £750 million. That includes the small business bonus, the unique in the UK business growth accelerator, the UK's first nursery relief, and of course enhanced relief for broadband. We've also expanded the small business bonus scheme, lifting in total 100,000 premises out of business rates altogether. And of course, following the Community Empowerment Act, councils now have the powers to go even further if they want to reduce rates further than that locally. So we are doing more than any other government anywhere else in the UK, and we will continue to do so. We wouldn't be able to afford to do most of this, though, if we went along with the Tory suggestions to take more than £500 million out of our budget to give tax cuts to the richest people in our country.
Question number 6, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report's call for a transformative change.
First Minister.
I welcome this important report and the new evidence that it provides. We are, of course, already doing a great deal here in Scotland to address biodiversity loss through our biodiversity strategy. We will consider the report's findings very carefully and look to ensure that our actions will produce the transformative change that is needed. The report is a significant step on the way to the 2020 conference of parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to be held in China, where world governments will agree their response to the new evidence. Scotland is playing an active role in this work, and I can tell the Chamber that we've agreed with the Convention that a conference which will contribute to developing the response will be held in Scotland early in 2020 in the lead up to the China Conference of the Parties.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the First Minister for this answer, but this report is indeed a stark look at how we are letting down our natural world globally. And Scotland faces the same challenges. 1 in 11 species in Scotland are at risk of extinction, and we need stronger laws and implementation. Biodiversity in our climate and environment emergency deserves the same collective focus and energy as our climate change does. Does the First Minister agree that it now seems extremely unlikely that we will meet our 2020 global biodiversity targets? And will the First Minister commit today to developing a long-term plan for action post-2020?
First Minister.
I agree with Claudia Beamish in the general thrust of her question. In terms of the biodiversity targets, first, Scotland has more to do, like all countries have more to do. We are currently on track to achieve 7 out of the 20 targets agreed by the international community in 2010 Another 12 are progressing towards the target, but we need to step up our work to meet the deadline. Now, that's not good enough, but it compares favourably to the global picture, where progress has only been made on 4 of the 20 targets. So we recognise the additional work that all countries, including Scotland, has to do. We're committed, and if we do this, we'll be the first country anywhere to do this, to carry out a thorough analysis of what we are already doing, what more we need to do, and what we need to do differently. And by the end of this year, ministers will write to the Environment Committee with our initial assessment of that. So I do agree about the importance of this. I do agree that it's as important as the challenge on climate change, and as on climate change, I don't underestimate the difficulties and the complexities and the challenges, but as on climate change, I, and I'm sure all of us, want Scotland to be leading the way.
Mark Ruskell.
The UN report highlights once again that our seas are under attack and beautiful habitats like our flameshell reefs risk extinction. 1/5 of Europe's coastline is in Scotland. Does the First Minister believe that just 2 fisheries protection vessels are enough to defend our coasts from vested interests intent on illegally plundering our marine protected areas?
First Minister.
Well, I mean, that's something we as a government require to keep under review. I do believe the resources we have just now in terms of fisheries protection are appropriate, but like all issues like this is something that the government has to look at on an ongoing basis. The protection of our natural environment is such a priority that across, just as on climate change, the obligation on all of us now is to look afresh at everything we are doing and make a decision, as we had to do on a difficult decision this week, and decide whether we are living up to those obligations. And as a government, we are committed to doing that, and I hope we have not just the cooperation but the wholehearted support of parties across the chamber as we do so.
And Maurice Golden.
On the 14th of September 2016, I raised the need for a biodiversity baseline with the Environment Secretary in order to monitor the success of our efforts to protect Scotland's wildlife. Given the First Minister's answers, will she now recognise that a biodiversity baseline should be a priority?
First Minister.
If we go back, I think 1 or 2 answers ago, what I said is we are carrying out an analysis of what we are doing, where we need to do more and what we need to do differently. That is what we will report to the Environment Committee by the end of this year, providing, I think, the baseline that Maurice Golden is asking for. He's absolutely right. We need to know the baseline so we can then monitor our performance against this. There are big challenges here for Scotland and for all countries. I think we can take some pride and some confidence in the fact that we are already leading the way globally, but that's not enough. We need to, as we've done on climate change, raise the bar of global leadership and make sure that we are continuing to get over that much higher than anybody else, and we're committed to doing that, and I look forward to having the support of members across the chamber as we do so.
Thank you very much, and that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Kenneth Gibson on changes to pension credit could cost mixed-age couples £7,320 annually. Before we do, we're going to have a short suspension to allow the gallery members and the Minister to change seats. A short suspension.
Thank you. Can I ask members of the public leaving the public area to do so quietly, as the Parliament is still in session, and we're moving on to the next debate. The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 15570 in the name of Kenneth Gibson on changes to pension credit could cost mixed-age couples £7,320 annually. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and can ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Kenneth Gibson to open the debate. Mr Gibson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I first wish to thank Age Scotland and Engender for their very helpful briefings. When I submitted today's motion back in January, I held on to some hope that the UK Tory government would reconsider its callous decision to force newly retired people whose partners are younger than the state retirement age of 65 to claim universal credit rather than pension credit. Unfortunately, with this change coming to force next Wednesday, 15th of May, it seems that the Tories are choosing to ignore calls from Age Scotland, Citizens Advice Scotland, Engender, MSPs, MPs and campaigners who have expressed concerns about the impact this change will have on some of Scotland's poorest pensioners. This is no minor change. The switch to universal credit could cost affected households £140.44 a week, or £7,320 a year. Put another way, the pension credit guarantee tops up a couple's income to a minimum of £12,940 a year. Under universal credit, the standard allowance entitles couples to less than half of that. Such a cut could devastate a couple's finances and ultimately their overall health and well-being. As Age Scotland said when the announcement was sneaked out on the day of the first meaningful vote on Brexit, such an outrageous new policy will do nothing but penalise older couples of mixed age, making them poorer for living together. As if being forced onto universal credit, the problems of which are well documented, wasn't bad enough, the loss of pension credit will have a profound impact on other aspects of social security delivery as a passporting benefit. If eligible for pension credit, one will receive free NHS dental treatment, cold weather payments, help with housing benefit and council tax. The loss of such support can only impoverish our poorest pensioners. To illustrate this, I offer the example of a mixed-age couple renting a one-bedroom property in North Ayrshire in Council Tax Band C with a monthly rent of £373 and receiving a state pension of £160 a week in pension credit. Their total loss after being moved to universal credit would be £9,223.80 a year, an enormous sum. Indeed, the Scottish Government estimate that by 2020-21, 3,800 mixed-age households in Scotland alone will collectively lose around £20.8 million. It's shocking that the UK Tory Government has not considered that this change may force couples who find themselves financially pressured into splitting up. While it argues that pension credit was not designed for working-age claimants, universal credit was never designed for pensioners, as it includes no additional support for a couple where one member is not expected to work because they are over state pension age. Justification for the policy is therefore deeply flawed. Even more gallingly, as touched on earlier, these changes were sneaked out in a written statement by Parliamentary Secretary for Pensions and Financial Inclusion Guy Opperman MP on the evening of 14th of January 2019, when the Prime Minister suffered a crushing defeat at Westminster as MPs rejected a Brexit deal. This drama allowed pension credit changes to be buried deep in the news agenda, even though it will drive many older people and their partners in Scotland and across the UK into poverty. Age Scotland responded quickly to the statement and is working hard to help as many eligible people as possible claim pension credit before the 15th of May changeover. Tories might try to cover their backs by stating that this change was legislated for in 2012 and it's too late to turn the tide. Age Scotland, however, told the Social Security Committee that the Welfare Reform Act was 182 pages long, with provisions on mixed-age couples buried among the introduction of universal credit and personal independence payments. However, these changes can still be stopped. The UK Government presented these reforms as gender neutral because universal credit treats women and men in the same circumstances equally. However, Engender understood that pension credit changes will compound the situation already faced by women affected by the increase in the state pension qualifying age. Changes to pension credit entitlement, which may otherwise have offered a lifeline for women against state pension inequality, will hit this group of WASPy women especially hard. In addition, women are more likely to be the younger person in a couple having to work or claim working age benefits, despite the likelihood that they already have unpaid caring duties. It seems the UK Tory Government cares little about the impact this policy will have. In announcing the change, the UK Government must have known how many people will be affected in each UK nation. Such information is crucial for devolved governments and the third sector in order to adequately prepare their services. In spite of this, the UK Government has still not provided a comprehensive geographic breakdown. Of course, with Michelle Ballantyne as their welfare spokesperson, it's little surprise that Tory MSPs have not challenged their Westminster counterparts to reverse or delay this change. When asked at the Social Security Committee only 2 weeks ago today if she would sign a letter from the committee asking for a 6-month extension to the 15th of May and 13th of August deadlines to allow both the Scottish and UK governments to do all they can to maximise benefit uptake, she replied, and I quote, "Do I care one way or the other? I probably do not actually, if I'm honest." That perfectly encapsulates the indifference Tories have towards the real suffering their policies inflict. These same Tories propose to take free TV licence away from over 75s, deny women born in the 1950s their full right to state pensions, and are pushing thousands of pensioners into poverty when the UK already has one of the lowest earnings to pensions ratios in Europe. It is imperative fairness is at the heart of our pension system, and that older people are treated with dignity. The risks are not just financial. People on lower incomes are also susceptible to poorer health. Reducing the incomes of some older people will force them to choose between heating and eating. It is undeniable that those who cannot afford to heat their homes are more likely to suffer from poor health, placing more stress on our NHS. The Scottish Government and our local authorities will be left to pick up the pieces of this disastrous, short-sighted policy. It is unrealistic to expect the Scottish Government to mitigate the impact of this cut. To do so for each Tory welfare reform would be impossible. By 2020-21, it is estimated that mitigating UK welfare cuts would cost £3.7 billion, 3 times the Police Scotland budget. Meanwhile, 100% of national insurance contributions raised in Scotland flow to the Treasury. Presiding Officer, I encourage any older person listening today who is concerned about their income to call Age Scotland's excellent helpline. It is free and available from Monday to Friday from 9 AM to 5 PM on 0800 1244 222. I'll repeat that number, 0800 1244 222. It offers free benefit checks and can support older people with pension credit claims. It is vital that older people claim the support to which they are entitled. Any situation where an older person would be financially better off living alone, claiming pension credit, than living as a couple claiming universal credit is unacceptable. The UK Tory Government must act to prevent this and must act now.
Thank you very much. I call Michelle Ballantyne to be followed by Gillian Martin. Ms Ballantyne, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I actually thank Mr Gibson for bringing this debate to the Chamber, because hopefully it will ensure that anyone who is entitled to pension credit is made aware of the changes, and if they want to, ensure they apply before the deadline. Mr Gibson is right on a couple of things. Certainly it was part of the 2012 Welfare Reform Bill, and the decision was made back then. It was actually debated then, and there were a number of discussions around it. But the actual reminding of bringing out the date of change did come out on the date he said, and I think that was a concern to everybody. However, it is important to note that while the change to entitlement does take place next week, applicants have until the 13th of August 2019 to register a backdated claim if they were eligible next week. And that gap is really important in terms of making sure as many people as possible do actually get what they're entitled to at the moment. Eligibility for benefits is probably one of the most contentious subjects, and whatever the decisions of governments, there will always be individuals and organisations who will argue that a decision is not fair. It is therefore the role of government to try and find a balance that is consistent in its application and transparent to the people. Now, pensions are particularly complicated, and we have a situation currently where people who have not reached state pension age can claim pension age benefits. Pension credit is designed to help our most vulnerable elderly, those who have not built up a pension and have no other recourse to funds after retirement age. It is rightly designed to ensure a minimum level of income, and I have no doubt that everyone in this chamber supports it. However, when Mr Gibson and others talk of a loss of income of £7,320 for mixed-age couples, that will rightly cause alarm, and it should. However, it should also be made clear that this change is not retrospective, so any mixed-age couple currently in receipt of pension credit or who successfully apply before the deadline will not lose this benefit unless their circumstances change. The question that arises when faced with a mixed-age couple is one of whether a working-age adult should be exempt from the same obligations that their peers incur by dint of a partnership with a pensionable individual. As pension credit has a 100% withdrawal rate for earnings over a small threshold of around £10 per week for most couples, there is in fact a positive disincentive for a younger partner to work. The difference that Mr Gibson is quoting assumes a comparison of a couple who have no income beyond their welfare entitlements. However, as universal credit has a 63% withdrawal rate over a much larger work allowance, for a couple it stands at around £503. The reality is any pension that the older partner has, or any income that is earned by the younger partner, means that that gap will in fact be smaller. However, one area of real concern to me is the entitlement to passported benefits, and that is an area I think we should look closely at because of the potential impact of that change, and particularly so because the number of the relevant benefits are actually being devolved to this Parliament, and the Scottish Government will be able to make decisions about the criteria and entitlement. Around 2/3 of those eligible for pension credit currently do not claim, and I don't want anyone who is struggling to miss out on what they are due. So I hope that this discussion does in fact raise awareness. Interestingly, on the point of Mr Gibson's comments about what I said in committee, I can't remember off the top of my head where it was in private, but if it was, I shall certainly be bringing that back to Chamber to discuss. But however, my comment... Do you want to hear what I've got to say? However, my comment was around whether we sent a letter or not.
It better be a point of order. If it's a debating point, it's not a point of order. I warn you, Ms White. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. A point of order, Ms Ballantyne said it was in private. It wasn't. It's all over the newspapers.
I heard...
the newspapers. It wasn't in private.
Excuse me, Ms White, please sit down. I heard what was said. That's not actually what Ms Ballantyne said, if. But I won't take comments from the front bench here either. But that's a matter that can be raised by others in debate if they wish, or afterwards. Thank you. Sorry, Ms Ballantyne.
Thank you. No, I was merely going to say that that comment was made in reference as to whether we sent a letter at that time, and it was backed up by saying, if I remember correctly, that I felt we were probably too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Gillian Martin, who will be followed by Elaine Smith. Ms Martin, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Ruth Davidson returned to frontline politics at the weekend, she said in her conference speech, a secure pension age has gone. Well, too true. Pension security in the UK has gone, and the Tories are set to make life even harder for pensioners, and I thank Kenneth Gibson for securing this debate to allow this to be discussed. Because changes to pension credit will cost the poorest in Scotland up to £7,000 a year, a large chunk of money for anyone to lose, but the difference between eating and heating for their poorest pensioners. The fact is the UK state pension is already the worst in the developed world. This is according to data from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. As a percentage of earnings, the UK government pays out only 29%, putting it at the bottom of the table. And this is in comparison to other EU nations like the Netherlands, which pays out 100%, and Portugal, which offers 94%, or Italy, which gives 93.2%. Before the independence referendum in 2014, Labour's Gordon Brown warned that Scotland leaving the UK would come with, and I quote, a pensions time bomb. The Tory government backed that claim, but as we now know, they went on to increase the pension age for women without notice, meaning that some will lose up to £30,000. Now that's a pensions time bomb. And I stand with the WASPy women in their condemnation of the Tory UK government who have let them down. And it's low earners and women that are bearing the biggest cost of pension reforms. The numbers of pension-aged people having to use food banks is a national disgrace. And of course, the announcement of these changes was revealed, this latest pensions time bomb was revealed by the Tory government on the eve of Prime Minister Theresa May's humiliating Brexit deal defeat in January. Slipped under the radar, and with no debate or vote in the House of Commons, this cut has been made as part of the Welfare Reform Act, and the pensioners of the UK, present and future, have been scammed. And this is simply more bad news for women born in the 1950s who've been affected by the increase in state pension age already. No, I won't take an intervention. There are hundreds of women in the north east of Scotland and in my constituency of Aberdeenshire East who have been affected by the increase of pension age, and I have met with them repeatedly, and I stand with them in their condemnation. And this policy could impact them even further when they're already struggling under the weight of changes made. My party does not support the unfair manner in which these changes were made, and we have repeatedly asked for the UK Government to give those women their money. More than 2 million women have been affected by the changes already made, and now changes to pension aid will cause even more financial uncertainty for them. People who claim a disability benefit too will also be heavily impacted, and more than 50% of those who receive pension credits also claim a disability benefit. In 2018, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's UK Poverty Report highlighted that previous falls in pensioner poverty was in part due to the introduction of pension credits. And Labour are not off the hook here either. They campaigned with the Tories in 2013 and 14 to frighten pensioners into thinking they'd lose their pensions in independent Scotland. Well, it's time we took control of the pensions for our Scottish older people and give them the retirement they deserve. The UK is not working for Scotland's pensioners.
Thank you very much. I call Lade Smith, who will be followed by Alison Johnson. Ms Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank Kenneth Gibson for securing the debate today on an issue which will affect thousands of pensioners and couples across the country. The motion before us condemns the Tory Government's decision to make this change, and I most certainly support that. It's a particularly harmful change in the way pensioners and mixed-age couples receive income, and it will undoubtedly result in hardship, pushing people further into poverty and affecting health and well-being. So while this detrimental change is part of the Tories' failed austerity policies, which have caused misery for families up and down the UK, it is disappointing that the Scottish Government have not done more to raise awareness of the change. However, of course, Kenneth Gibson's debate today and motion should help to do that, since we're imminently looking at the change happening. And of course, a further issue that's been mentioned is that of the high number of people who are eligible but not claiming due to lack of awareness. As I mentioned last week in a question in this chamber, Age Scotland has cited figures from the DWP which estimate that up to 40% of couples who are entitled to receive pension credit are not receiving it. And although couples currently receiving pension credits will not be immediately affected by the upcoming changes, they could be affected if their circumstances change at any point in the future. And that is a massively important point that has to be made in this debate today. Of course, the policy is the latest in a long line of Tory Government reforms that, as usual, will have a greater impact on the most vulnerable in society. Again, Age Scotland tells us 38% of people over the age of 50 are financially squeezed, while 4 in 10 pensioner couples struggle to pay their bills. And pensioner credit is a vital tool in helping people who are in pensioner poverty, which affects an estimated 170,000 people in Scotland. The benefit change will also have a greater effect on women, there is no doubt about that, and those are women who have already suffered by an increased state pension age, as mentioned by Gillian Martin. They were not adequately warned of that, and they were not given time to make alternative arrangements for retirement. These new pension credit rules will have a further harsh impact on these women, and as Kenneth Gibson himself mentioned in his opening speech, the UK Government has presented their welfare reforms as gender neutral. But for women and men who apply for universal credit, their actual circumstances are rarely the same and often very different. This is due to societal persistence of underlying traditional gender norms, with many women spending longer out of work, at home and caring roles. State and private pension levels are more unfavourable to women due to this. Part-time work, the gender pay gap, historic maternity and gender discrimination at work also means that contributions have been lower and perhaps no national insurance contributions made. Women who have had long or multiple breaks in employment are often more reliant on state pension as their core income. Clearly, this change has certainly not been poverty-proofed, but neither has it been subject to a gender impact assessment. Presiding Officer, the impact of this policy doesn't even just end with the people directly affected, because it's also going to have unintended consequences on local economies. If new applicant couples are in receipt of over £7,000 less per year, then that is definitely going to impact on local economies. And as we know, our high streets have long been declining as more people shop online and jobs are being lost. And pensioners, of course, are still the least likely people to be buying online. So even if the Tories are not interested in personal hardship, then I would have actually thought the impact on local business might cause them some concern. In conclusion, the UK Government really must think again about this harmful policy change. But if they are not going to do that, and it doesn't look like they are, then the Scottish Government need to do their best to highlight the fact that it is happening imminently. It will undoubtedly have a massive impact on pensioner poverty in this country.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I call Alison Johnston, who will be followed by Alistair Allen. Ms Johnston, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Kenny Gibson for bringing this very important issue to the Chamber for debate today. It seems that just when we get our heads around one change in its impact, along comes another, often affecting the very same people. The changes to pension credit outlined in the motion this afternoon are yet another, which will have a hugely negative impact on the incomes of households affected. 3,800 households in Scotland could be as much as £7,000 a year worse off, claiming after the 15th of May as compared to claiming before. With so many cuts and changes coming down the line, it is all the more important that people are well informed, yet as we've heard, this hasn't happened. The new mixed-aged couple rules were legislated for as long ago as 2012, as has been mentioned, but they were only announced in January, just 4 months before the policy comes into force, in the lowest profile way possible, a written statement. There are clear parallels with the women's state pension age change here. That was similarly legislated for ahead of time, but not clearly notified to people. And as a consequence, WASPy women are retiring much later than they thought they would, with their plans for retirement in tatters. It is shocking that the lesson highlighted by the tireless campaigning of the WASPy women hasn't yet been learned by the UK government. And all that is made even worse by the fact that pension credit already has an insufficient take-up rate, with 40% of those eligible for it not claiming. So that means that many couples are eligible to claim under the current system, but in less than a week will have to claim under the new system and may lose thousands of pounds as a result. There simply hasn't been enough time for organisations which support older people to raise awareness. The DWP's justification for this is that pension credit wasn't designed for people of working age, and that the change will mean, and I'm quoting, the same work incentives apply to the younger partner as apply to other people of the same age. But while pension credit may not have been intended for people of working age, it's equally true that universal credit wasn't intended to be claimed by pensioners. It includes no additional support for a couple where one member isn't expected to work because they're over the state pension age, and as the state pension age rises, they will be in that unfair situation for longer. And note that phrase, work incentives. That is very telling. This is really about making the younger partner subject to benefit sanctions. Yet we have overwhelming evidence to suggest that benefit conditionality and sanctions don't work. A study by Glasgow and Heriot-Watt universities found that the threat or experience of a benefit sanction is routinely ineffective in facilitating people's entry into or progression within the paid labour market over time, as well, of course, as causing huge stress and worry in the process. And so, in the name of extending the reach of benefit sanctions yet further, the UK government is making almost 4,000 households worse off. That is shameful. It is no surprise that Age Scotland refer to this as an outrageous new policy and say that it will have a devastating impact on Scotland's poorest pensioners, and they are urging the government to reverse it. In closing, Presiding Officer, I too would like to draw attention to the gendered impact as highlighted by Engender and others in the Chamber. There's yet another change to social security entitlements that hit women harder than men. In this case, women are more likely to be the younger partner and subject to conditionality. And for women impacted by poorly notified increases to the state pension age, changes to their pension credit entitlement, which may otherwise have offered them a lifeline in the absence of their pension, will be hit especially hard. To close, Greens are dismayed by yet another hole being put in our already severely frayed social security safety net, one which was announced in the quietest way possible, meaning that couples who might have been able to exempt themselves will no longer be able to. And all that to extend a thoroughly discredited system of sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Alistair Allen, who will be followed by Jeremy Balfour. Mr Allen, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin firstly by thanking Kenneth Gibson for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. As we've heard from Wednesday, newly retired pensioners will be barred from claiming pension credit if they have a younger partner and will instead be forced onto universal credit. Now, there are estimates that the impact of these changes on the average claimant will, as we've heard, be in the region of between £5,000 and £6,000 per year. And the financial consequences could be even more far-reaching than that. Pension credit, as members will know, is a passporting benefit, meaning that mixed-age couples could lose out on other forms of assistance. This includes cold weather payments, housing benefit, council tax reductions, social fund funeral payments, and possibly their entitlement to the warm home discount. Now, as if this policy wasn't bad enough, the means by which it was delivered do, in my view, add considerable insult to injury. As Mr Gibson mentioned, by sneaking this amendment out by means of a written statement from a DWP minister on the same day as the first meaningful, if I may use that last word rather broadly, vote in the House of Commons on Brexit, the UK government clearly wanted this to go as unnoticed as possible and avoid scrutiny over a decision that they knew very well would be unpopular. I would like to pay tribute to Age Scotland for their efforts in highlighting these changes. It's certainly worth considering, I believe, a hypothetical example provided by Age Scotland to illustrate what this could mean for a typical household in this situation. Peter, they give us as a hypothetical example, aged 70, draws a state pension of £140 a week. His wife, Jean, aged 62, gave up work 5 years ago to care for her father, who has recently died. They own their own home and have a few £100s in savings. They receive pension credit to top up their joint income to £248 a week. After the rule change, Peter and Jean's position will be protected if they are still receiving pension credit when any changes come in, as long as their circumstances stay the same. However, a couple in this situation who need to claim benefits for the first time after the 15th of May 2019 would not be entitled to pension credit due to Jean's age. Peter's state pension is too high for them to receive universal credit, so their joint income will just be Peter's state pension. If Jean cannot find a job, which may be difficult given her age and her time out of the labour market for caring, this will be their income for another 4 years until Jean reaches SPA at age 66. And by this time, Peter will be 74. However, if Peter was living on his own because they separate or Jean dies, he would be able to claim pension credit, in which case his state pension will be topped up to £163 a week, considerably more than the universal credit standard for a couple of about £115 a week. Presiding officer, it's very clear from those and many other examples that changes to pension credit are going to have a significant impact on mixed-age pensioner households when they come into force next week. For the UK government to penalise people simply for having a younger partner is completely unacceptable. This is a benefit designed for some of our poorest pensioners, and they should not be forced to pay for the price of the Tories' ideologically driven cuts to welfare. The UK government and its supporters cannot continue to brush aside the deep and damaging failings of their social security system. Now, Mr Gibson has already mentioned that only a few weeks ago in committee, when the Tories social security spokesperson was asked if she would support a cross-party letter to the UK government calling for a delay to these changes, she replied, "Do I care one way or the other? I probably do not, actually, if I'm honest." Presiding officer, I hate to break this to the member. That was not in private session. I'm quoting the official report because it was a discussion on the public record. But the more important point is, presiding officer, that the indifference of the governing party in the UK continues to push families into poverty and to force people to turn to food banks in order to get by. I hope that this Parliament, by contrast, does not share the Tories' indifference about this matter. It's time now for the Tories to reverse this attack on low-income pensioner households.
Thank you. Can I say before I call the next member, if you just sit down just a moment, Mr Balfour, in view of the number of members remaining to speak in today's debate, I'm minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. I would ask Kenneth Gibson to move such a motion.
Moved, presiding officer.
Are members in agreement? Thank you very much. No members having disagreed, I therefore extend this debate under Standing Order Rule 8.14.3, and I now call on Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Mr Balfour, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's important to start with what pension credit was designed to do. It was designed to provide long-term support for pensioner households who are no longer economically active. that being the key word, economically active. It was never designed to support work age claimants. And I think that that change is simply wrong to talk about. The Scottish Conservatives want to make work pay and encourage people to be in work. And this change means that the same work incentives will apply to the younger partner as well as to other people of the same age, and ensures that taxpayer support is directed where it is most needed and help those in society that need it. I think we have to be careful, and I'm sure Gillian Martin wasn't saying this, but it was perhaps implied that this is not a retrospective change. Anyone who is in receipt of this benefit now, it will not change. If you're currently a mixed-age pensioner couple, pension credit will not stop. It is new claimants that are affected, or, as we've heard, if their circumstances change. So I think, again, we have to be careful with the language that we use within the Chamber this afternoon.
Lane Smith.
I thank the member for taking the intervention, but I wonder if he has a view on whether or not this outrageous policy might be subject to legal challenge under sex discrimination, and, in fact, does it undermine the right to family life under the Human Rights Act?
Mr Balfour.
Well, as someone who's not practiced law for over 30 years, I think I will avoid getting into legal debate. Where I think there could be consensus on this issue this afternoon is in regard to the take-up. As Alison Johnston has already pointed out, Deputy Presiding Officer, there is at least 40% of people who could be claiming this at the moment who are not. And that is disappointing. I also do agree that the way that this policy was announced was perhaps disappointing, and there has been a lack of advertising of what is going to happen by the UK government. However, as Michelle Ballantyne has pointed out, you can apply up to August this year, and it will be looked at. And I do wonder whether the Scottish Government would commit to doing some more advertising of this over the next few months. In their response to the committee, they did point out that some work was being done by Age Scotland, but no work has been done by Scottish Government. And I would also make the same plea to the UK Government as well, that over these remaining weeks and months that are still available, that more is done to advertise and so that the take-up is being properly known. I do think there is an interesting issue as well in regard to why take-up is comparatively so low. And again, as we roll out new benefits here in Scotland, we do have to look at how will take-up happen and why are people not taking up the benefits that they are entitled to. I think, in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we just have to be careful sometimes with the language that we use, so we do not put fear into people who are on this benefit already. And we also have to work very carefully to make sure that take-up on this benefit or on other benefits is fully maximised so that people get what they deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Balfour. I call Polly McNeill to be followed by Bob Doris. Mr Doris will be the last speaker in the open debate. Mr McNeill.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank Kenneth Gibson for a very well-written motion, an excellent speech, and for bringing this to the Chamber. And I hope it gives an opportunity for there to be full consensus and cross-party support on what Kenneth Gibson is trying to achieve against the Tories' policy. I would go as far as to say I have not seen a more callous welfare reform than this. I would go as far as to say I've not seen a welfare reform proposal that has so undermined family life than the one before us. I remember when the Labour government introduced pension credits along with child tax credits, and Gordon Brown did it to lift thousands of pensioners and families out of poverty. And he did it in the full knowledge that there were pensioner couples, some of working age, and he did it to dramatically improve the living standards of those pensioners. And he achieved success in doing that. And to roll back those achievements will absolutely, as other members have said, push more pensioners into poverty, because we know it's new couples or new claimants. But we know from experience of the tax credit system that any change in circumstance, any change, you're in that pot of people and you will lose your pension credit. I think Elaine Smith is absolutely right. It's the element which is so scandalous is the unfairness of mixed age couples, which this applies to. And that's an important point to concentrate on. It must be at least indirect discrimination, if not direct discrimination, because when you look at this, it is women who will bear the brunt of this, who tend to be younger. So I hope some organisations might be looking at how this can already be challenged. So we've got the 14th of May to the 13th of August to submit a claim if you haven't already done so. But I'm afraid I think there will be thousands of people who will still lose out, but we've got a job to do there in making them aware of that. Reaching pension age where you don't have an adequate pension, and this is primarily the root of the problem. There are many employers that are required to provide a pension these days, but some of the pensions, particularly in the private sector, are absolutely appalling and have led to low pay and low pensions. If you're that person, you retire and you have that sharp drop in income, you're actually going to be penalised in every way if you're part of a mixed couple, because it places a much greater burden on the younger partner, where they're now going to, in effect, play the role of the state by providing and making up for that income. There's no doubt in my mind that what I think is a heartbreaking policy, that those couples who have age gaps 10, 12, 15 years and beyond, you can see the heavy burden that's going to have on the younger person and, in fact, the relationship. Which is why I say I haven't really seen a policy that's so undermined family life than the one before us. And not to mention, so you've heard from Kenny Gibson the figures, but those are real figures. They're not manufactured. They are real figures. And it isn't just the loss of the up to £7,000. We already know the hardship and trauma of people forced onto universal credit, a system that is still far to be ready for its purpose, and the trauma of being locked into that. I really fear for those couples, and I'm quite happy to use that word. Elaine Smith said that the level of impact on the local economy will be substantial if you actually look at the losses, which in the future will be significant. Never mind the impact on the housing crisis, because the losses of 28 million, I think Alistair Allen mentioned, does mean there's going to be quite a large societal impact. I'll close the presiding officers at 4 minutes. Or 5. I'll just finish by saying I think it's a heartbreaking policy. Many people have no control over this whatsoever, because it's sprung on them at a time where they can't even plan to change their family income. I think we've got to stick together on this. I don't think it's too late to stop this. I think we've got to get out there, argue our case, and hope that something can be done. And maybe the Tories on the other side of this might actually have some compassion for once in their life and decide to join us in calling for some change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now call Bob Doris. Mr Doris, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start off, as others have done, by thanking Kenneth Gibson, MSP, for securing this absolutely vital debate. As convener of the Social Security Committee in this Parliament, I'm deeply worried about these pension credit changes will effectively cuts to some low-income pensioner households. Some pensioners are in effect simply been targeted because of the age of their partner, and that's simply not right. These concerns led to our committee holding an evidence session with Age Scotland and Citizens Advice Scotland. The evidence they gave was deeply worrying. It was alarming. But of course, alarm bells should be ringing. The original policy document relating to this dates back to 2011, actually. It was produced by the UK Government Minister, Chris Grayling, MP. We should not be surprised that the man who gave ferry contracts to companies without ferries designed a policy to deny pension protections to low-income pensioners. Adam Stakura from Age Scotland told our committee these cuts would have a devastating impact on the finances of the poorest pensioners. He also raised concerns over the impact on passported benefits, as we've heard, such as cold weather payments, council tax reduction and housing benefits. So those not relying on passported benefits will lose up to £7,000 a year, and those relying on passported benefits potentially £10,000 a year. And this is not an abstract debate, but a looming reality for low-income mixed couple households. Here's an example that Adam Stakura gave our committee. He said, I was speaking to a gentleman at the meeting of older people in Glasgow last week who told me that he was 70, his wife was 60 and still working. He is the first person whom I have spoken to who's been a mixed-age couple on a very low state pension. He did not realise he might be entitled to pension credit, so he wasn't claiming it. So his first step was going to be to call their helpline. Because of the 10-year age gap between him and his wife, and the rise in the state pension age, so WASPy women affected, as previously mentioned, he realised that it could be 6 or 7 years until they could claim pension credit after the policy change. Presiding Officer, that's simply appalling. Our committee agreed to urgently write to the UK Secretary of State, Amber Rudd, raising our concerns and urging these cuts to be scrapped. That was, of course, except the Tory members who did not agree to sign up to that letter. We received a reply from the UK Minister for Pensions and Financial Inclusion, Guy Opperman MP. Now, given the policy intent that Guy Opperman MP is proposing, his ministerial title is laughable. But I suppose one aspect is accurate, because he's the Minister for Pensions. He's certainly not the Minister for Pensioners, because he's letting them down categorically here. Well, he, unsurprisingly, rejected our representations. But let me tell you a couple of things he did say, Presiding Officer, in his reply to myself as convener. He said it is important to be clear that this is about making sure that all working age people, irrespective of their partner's age, are subject to the same labour market approach. What an idiotic thing to say. Fundamentally, what he is doing is discriminating against pensioner households. He's distinguishing between some low-income pensioner households in poverty and against other ones. So he's absolutely wrong-headed in relation to discriminating against people simply because they love with someone who is younger than them. He also said, Presiding Officer, pensioners and mixed-age couples claiming universal credit will not be subject to any work-related conditionality rules. However, conditionality for working-age partners will be tailored to meet their specific circumstances, just as it would be for any other claimant. So there you have it, Presiding Officer. Not only will some households be £7,000 worse off, they'll be subject to sanction under universal credit, a double whammy and simply unacceptable. On the 29th of April, our committee wrote back to Guy Opperman asking for a 6-month delay, given that 40% of households do not claim the pension credit they're entitled to. I have to say that Michelle Ballantyne and Jeremy Balfour signed up to that letter. I was disappointed they didn't sign up to rejecting the policy intent, but they did sign up to delay. But it's only 6 days now till this kicks in. We've had no reply. This is going to happen unless there's a U-turn by the UK government. But, Presiding Officer, I think the final thing to say, other than showing solidarity, yes?
Michelle Ballantyne. Mr Doris, as the convener, would you agree that when I said to you that I didn't care either way with the sent letter, it was because I felt it was too late? And you're now saying exactly that we haven't had a response yet, but I was quite happy to sign up to the letter on the basis that I thought there were things that needed to be looked at.
Bob Doris.
Well, my interpretation, first of all, is that Michelle Ballantyne agrees with these changes, which I find appalling, quite frankly. You're defending these changes, but I was pleased you signed up to a letter, even though you were completely indifferent about signing up to that letter. But you did sign up to it, to fair play. But ultimately, we are tinkering at the edges of trying to defend the income of impoverished pensioners in our country. There's got to be a better way of doing this. By God, can we get power over pensions and benefits to this Parliament? Because no way would we treat pensioners as appallingly as the Tory government does.
Thank you very much. I now recall Shirley Ann Somerville to close for the Government. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd also like to begin by thanking Kenneth Gibson for bringing this important matter to the Chamber today and for the contributions of everyone that has taken part. The impact of the UK Government's decision to change entitlement to pension credit will, like so many other of their decisions, impact on the poorest in our society and indeed the most vulnerable. Indeed, in this case, they are paying the price simply for having a younger partner. This change, which, as we have heard, could see a drastic impact on a couple's finances, is just another example of the UK Government making it more difficult for people to get the support that they need. We could spend hours talking about the problems with universal credit, and indeed we have done so, Presiding Officer, on many occasions in this chamber. This change in particular will force even more people onto a system that simply isn't fit for purpose. The issues with universal credit, such as the 5-week minimum wait for a first payment and the difficulties many people have even receiving the correct payment, are bad enough. But for anyone in a couple where one person is under and one over the state pension age, the level of support they are now entitled to will be even lower. Simply put, the UK Government has made the decision to give these couples less money to live on. And as Alison Johnston and others have quite rightly pointed out, they are opening more people up to the discredited sanction regime. That's not to mention the fact that this decision was announced and the commencement of this policy was announced quietly, as many have pointed out, through a written ministerial statement on the day of the meaningful vote on the 14th of January, just 4 months before the policy came into effect. At that time, Age UK accused the UK Government of attempting to bury bad news, and I couldn't agree more. Whilst it can be argued that it is fairer for a person of working age to be subject to the same benefit as everyone else in that position, the loss of pension credit for those on pension-age partners is extremely unfair and completely unjust, as is the sanction regimes and many other aspects of universal credit that underpins the benefit system. As Kenneth Gibson, Alison Johnston have pointed out, universal credit is not designed for those of a pension age. I wrote to the UK Government earlier this year and asked to see the impact assessment that had been carried out on this policy. In his response, Guy Opperman, the UK Government's Minister for Pensions, told me that there was no impact assessment, only that the DWP had published some ad hoc statistics. All these statistics showed where the numbers affected and the money to be saved, nothing about the impact on people's lives. Mr Opperman also wrote to the Chair of the Working Pensions Committee to say that as the UK Government makes no forecast of poverty rates, an assessment of the impact of the mixed-age couples' changes on poverty has therefore not been made. One of the aspects which it is very important, and I'm very pleased that many of the contributors today have highlighted, is the impact that this policy change will have, particularly on women. Kenneth Gibson, Gillian Martin, Elaine Smith, Alison Johnston, many others brought this up. And the Engender briefing for this debate was quite right to point out that this compounds the issues that are affecting the WASPI women. Now, not long ago, Presiding Officer, we were in this chamber to debate the WASPI campaign and the fight of the WASPI women. The debate highlighted once again that the UK Government is denying the full state pensions to those women. And as I said during that debate, and I will repeat today, it is not the UK Government's money, it is the WASPI women's money, and they are absolutely entitled to that. And this is yet another unfortunate example, however, with the pension credit changes, of a welfare cut that's hitting women hardest. Elaine Smith also quite rightly pointed out to the fact that this isn't just about that personal hardship, difficult though that will be. It's about the health and well-being. It's about the social isolation that will be created with this pension change, and also about the important community impacts that this will have as well. This goes much wider than simply the pension credit couples that we're talking about. It has a much wider impact, as many changes to the welfare system it does. Alistair Allen and others also pointed out that this change has a direct impact on the passported benefits that many people will be entitled to. And for those that are relying on passported benefits, the cut from this pension credit change will be even more severe. This again goes to show that this has many different aspects that will be affecting many different people in different ways. The other important aspect which has been drawn out by many members is that the fact that those on pension credit at the moment are not safe as they continue. If there's one change of circumstance and they tell the DWP about that, they will also lose out. That puts those that are on pension credit at the moment in fear of losing their entitlements in the future. Can I return to one aspect which Michelle Ballantyne and Jeremy Belford and others pointed out about encouraging people to sign up for pension credit? I couldn't agree more. What a shame that the UK Government has never taken that seriously. When Jeremy Balfour talks to the fact, I'll get on to that. You just give me a minute, Mr Balfour, and I'll get on to what the Scottish Government is doing to pick up the pieces where the UK Government has failed, because the UK Government does not encourage take-up of benefits, as we are committed to do under the Scottish social security system. Where is the UK Government uptake campaign to be able to support those that will be affected by this? Let's not rely, with the greatest respect to the audience that's listening today and online, to a members' debate in the Scottish Parliament to encourage uptake. Where's the UK Government's uptake campaign to be able to encourage uptake for a pension credit that has one of the lowest rates? But I'll come on very specifically to what the UK Government action has been on this. My predecessor, Jean Freeman, back in 2017, announced a campaign to raise awareness for those with pension credit applications that they're not taken forward because they were unaware of it. There was radio ads, there was press ads, there was a concerted effort at that point. And we're also taking action to maximise the incomes of older people and those set to retire at the moment, particularly those that will be affected by this UK Government policy. That's why we're supporting older people through our financial health check service, offering free personalised advice on money matters to help people maximise their incomes, to reduce the poverty premium where they pay more for basic goods and services. The advice provides ranges from benefit uptake and council tax reduction to reducing utility bills and other household costs. Once again, the Scottish Government delivering for Scottish pensioners where they have been failed by the UK Government, but once again a stark example of how the UK benefit system is not fit for purpose, and I hear calls from those who don't want the powers to be delivered to this Parliament, for this Parliament to actually, and this Government, to pick up the pieces of a failed UK system. In closing, Presiding Officer, I am in full support of Mr Gibson and the motion today and would join once again in calling the UK Government to reconsider the changes to pension credit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting of Parliament till 2:30.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK Government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.